Erev Tov, good evening. So our Parsha this week is Pinchas. And one of the major tales we read is the story about Benot Tzlaf, the daughters of a guy named Tzlaf. That's a real popular name these days among Jewish babies, Tzlaf. So let's just refresh ourselves on the background and then try to examine what's going on. The daughters of Tzlaf of Manassite family. So they come from the tribe of Menashe, and Tzlaf was the son of Hefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, who was the son of Menashe. So we see, who was the son of Joseph. So we see the direct genealogy going from Jacob, Joseph, and then all the others until we get to Tzlaf, and then his daughters as well. The names of the daughters were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, 5 daughters. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the Kohen, the chieftains, meaning the head of each tribe, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So they make a very public moment out of this in front of everybody. And they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction of Korach's faction, which banded together against the Lord, but died for his own sin. And he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen." So the law has already been set down, and it was probably a long established tradition in the world at that time that sons inherit, daughters don't. But what do you do in a situation where there are no sons? So the father dies, doesn't leave any sons, and daughters don't inherit. So who gets the property? Who gets the estate? Who gets the land? It doesn't seem fair to the daughters that just because there weren't any brothers, that their father's stuff, instead of going, vertically to the next generation, probably goes horizontally, maybe to their father's brothers or somebody else. Okay, so that's the situation that we're faced with here. Interestingly, you might ask the question, suppose there were brothers. Why is it fair that the girls don't inherit anything? The case that they're bringing up is that no descendants will inherit. But if there was a male descendant, he would, but the girls still wouldn't. So that seems to be unfair to women in either case, if there are or if there aren't any male sons of their father. So that's number one. Number two is they're quick to point out our father was not part of the rebels with Korach who tried to unseat Moses. If he was, the implication of their question is, if he was part of Korach's group, then in a sense, they wouldn't have deserved to have any inheritance from their father. But they make a point of saying he wasn't with the bad guys, and it says he died of his own sin. Now, it doesn't simply say, and our father died and there were no sons and we're not allowed to inherit. That don't seem fair. Instead, we're told our father died, wasn't with Korach, but it was because of his own sin. Why do they need to tell us that? And then the Torah doesn't tell us what the sin was. So immediately the rabbis, as they read the Torah 1,500 years after it was written, they're always looking between the lines for things that are glossed over, things that are unclear. The rabbis want to know, what was his sin? Now, how are they going to know it, right? It doesn't say it. If it said it, we'd be fine, but it doesn't. But they need to know. But where are they going to find out? So what happens? They begin to work backwards from this spot, and they say, are there cases that we've recently read about in the Torah of people who committed public sins? So, if we go back to the 3 portions ago, it would have been the story of Korach. But here they say he wasn't in that group. That wasn't his sin. And then if we go back just before that, we'll read about the man who was Mikoshesh Eitzim, the man who was collecting wood on Shabbos. And he was arrested, and they said to God, what do we do with him? And ultimately, God said, capital punishment, he needs to be stoned. He broke Shabbos, right? So that's what the rabbis hook on to. They look backwards. Can we come up with an anonymous person who committed a sin? And it's not Korach, so maybe it was the one just before that, the collector of wood on Shabbos. So the rabbis in the Midrash say that must be it, because the rabbis hate anonymity. They hate the fact that we don't know who, a certain guy was. And now they have the ability to say, this is the guy. So even though the Torah doesn't deal with it, say it, is not explicit about it, the rabbis in the Midrash say the daughters of Tzlaf their father Tzlaf he was the one collecting sticks on Shabbos. Okay, so what I wanted to do was to know what was really going on behind the scenes with Tzlaf with the daughters, maybe with the relationship. You should also know that in contemporary times, when Jewish feminists are scouring the Torah to look for role models, who are they going to come up with? There aren't a lot of women, and the women in the Torah mostly aren't very active and aren't doing grand things. It's the men. It was a patriarchal world, and whoever wrote it reflected that. So modern feminists say, we want more. We need to know who these were. So as you can imagine, they immediately focus in on these 5 girls, adult women probably, who said, the law is unfair. It's against women. Only men can inherit. That doesn't seem right, especially when there's no man around, no brother for them to the property to go to. So modern feminists say, here is these 5 women, let's embrace them because they stood up and almost like modern suffragettes said, we deserve equal rights. We deserve equal pay. We deserve to be counted in the minyan, etc., etc., etc. So here's what I make of what might have happened. The daughters of Tzlaf are seen today as proto-feminists, bucking the patriarchal system in which only boys inherited and in which girls were passed over. They courageously stepped forward and challenged tradition and challenged Moses and challenged God. Because of them, the law changed, and that's the truth. Moses says to the girls, no sons, only daughters. Hadn't thought about that. Let me talk to God. And he goes to God, and God says, they're right. If there are no sons, then the daughters will inherit. If there are sons, the daughters won't, right? But if there are no sons, then the property goes down to the daughters. So we see not a major revolution. We see a couple of steps forward. Right. So they challenged Moses, they challenged God. Because of them, the law changed, and women for the first time were granted a degree of equality with men. Not full, but a degree. And yet, perhaps there is more to this story. So if you remember back in Numbers 15, once the Israelites came upon a man gathering wood in the wilderness on the Sabbath day. The Lord said to Moses, that man shall be put to death. So the whole community took him outside the camp and stoned him to death. Our rabbis taught the gatherer of the wood on Shabbat was Salaf. And that comes from the Talmud. So here's where I go in a different direction. Why was Salaf gathering wood on the Sabbath? What was so important that it couldn't wait a day? Could it be that he wanted some hot food there in the desert? Remember that all they had to eat there in Sinai was manna, and manna spoiled in the sun. So boiling it or frying it was out of the question. But the desert, as hot as it is during the day, can be brutally cold at night. Could it be that Slavchad's wife, or maybe even one of his daughters, was seriously ill and was freezing at night? There were no quilt comforters to keep her warm, no aspirin to bring down the fever. So a loving, concerned husband or father, he went out on a Saturday afternoon to find some wood so he could make a small fire. Okay, so again, we ask a question that the Torah doesn't ask, doesn't deal with. Why was he doing this? A couple of weeks ago when we touched on that, we said that perhaps it was about an act of rebellion. Nobody's going to tell me what I can or can't do. But maybe it wasn't just being contrary. Maybe what he was doing was trying to help his sick wife or a sick daughter. Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah confronted Moses and protested the unfairness of the inheritance laws. But if the rabbis in the Talmud were correct about the identity of the gatherer, the 5 daughters were silent about the injustice of their father being taken out and executed for the crime of collecting sticks on the Sabbath. So you wonder, if we go back to the story of Abraham, everybody cheers on Abraham for having questioned God and confronted God. How can you destroy the innocent people of Sodom and Gomorrah? There might be 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 innocent people. That would be horrible of you to do that, right? But then, a couple of chapters later, when God says to Abraham, I want you to take your son Isaac and slaughter him as a sacrifice, Abraham doesn't say anything. We praise Abraham for fighting for strangers. Why didn't Abraham open up his mouth and challenge God about, I should take and kill an innocent boy? So similarly, we praise the daughters of Tzlafchad for, being legal scholars. There's a problem here that in a family in which there are no sons and only daughters, what's supposed to happen to the property since women can't inherit, right? So we say, yeah, right on. But if we expect them and praise them for having challenged the law, similarly with Abraham, why couldn't we expect of them to challenge the death of their father if the rabbis are right? You're going to kill a guy because he was collecting sticks? It would be one thing if he did it publicly as a way of thumbing his nose at God and at Moses to observe Shabbat. But it doesn't say that that was his motivation. Suppose his motivation was, I've got a wife in there who is shivering, and I need to keep her warm. And I can't wait 24 hours, to go out and to collect wood and to make a fire. I got to do that now. Wouldn't we have wanted the daughters to have said, this is what we're worried about? Capital punishment for breaking Shabbos, right? But that, of course, isn't what they do. So that's the story of Salaf Chaim. Let's go to chapter 28. Chapter 28 is well known to us because it's always the second Torah, the maftir portion on Yontif. Whenever, be it Passover, Sukkot, Shavuos, Rosh Chodesh, whenever we have a second Torah, we always read about the sacrifices that were brought on that particular day. So chapter 28 is well known to us. It's also not well known to us because it's, frankly, rather boring and we don't pay attention. Let me give you an example. It starts with, this is what the sacrifices for daily, this is the sacrifice for Shabbos, this is the sacrifice for Rosh Chodesh, and then it goes through the holidays. So in chapter 28, verse 16, in the first month, which is Nisan, March, April, on the 14th day of the month, there shall be a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. And on the 15th day of that month, a festival unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. The first day shall be a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall present a gift, a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs. See that they are without blemish. The grain offering with them shall be of choice flour with oil mixed in. Prepare 3/10 of a measure for a bull, 2/10 for a ram, and for each of the 7 lambs prepare 1/10 of a measure. And there shall be 1 goat for a purification offering to make expiation in your behalf. You shall present these in addition to the morning portion of the regular burnt offering. You shall offer the like daily, this offering daily for 7 days as food during the festival of Passover, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord. They shall be offered with their libations, that was wine, in addition to the regular burnt offering. And the 7th day shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall not work at your occupations. So again, it just goes over our head or maybe a little lower in one ear and out the other. How many of which type of animal and how much of a grain offering, and et cetera, et cetera. So we hear this several times a year. We hardly ever pay attention. I also didn't want to pay attention to the details here. I was more captivated by its Passover and how do different people view it. So what Passover means to different people. To the Kohen, he was the one that had to bring all of these sacrifices. preparing an olah offering of 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, preparing a mincha grain offering of choice flour and oil, 3/10 of a measure for each bull, 2/10 of a measure for the ram, 1/10 of a measure for each lamb, preparing a goat for a chatat offering. What did Passover mean to the Levites? Practicing the appropriate songs to be sung in the tent of meeting in praise of God's salvation. What did the Israelite men, what did Passover mean to them? Figuring out how to catch up on all the missed work because of the holiday. So what I'm doing, what I do a lot, is moving the Bible people into Long Island 2020. And the notion that if you're going to take off for the holiday, it's one thing in the Jericho School District where they figure out the vacation each year for Passover. You don't have to worry about it. Many of us grew up, we didn't have vacation then, and if you were religious or observant, you took off and you had to make up all that extra work. Imagine if you were taking off from work, if you were an adult, and first of all, the boss could be very unhappy, and then you'd have to make up for all of that work. And again, maybe you'd take off for 1 day, 2 days, first 2 days of Passover, but there are really 4 days of Yontif during Passover, first 2, last 2. So Passover today, the men who would be working, women as well, would have to figure, how am I going to stay home, go to shul, and yet make up for work? That becomes a problem. The women, what did Passover mean to the women? And the answer would be getting rid of all the chametz, preparing the kitchen, and preparing all the food needed for the whole week. So, shopping at ShopRite becomes a major thing, and then cleaning the kitchen, especially if you're creating a kosher for Passover kitchen, switching all your dishes and utensils, and then nonstop cooking. A woman's work is never done when it comes to the holiday. Kids, what did Passover mean to the kids? Deciding what to ask for when the afikomen is found. Kids preparing probably Manishtana, how to sing it, and then if we steal the afikomen and Grandpa wants to give us a gift, what are we going to ask for? Kind of thing. What about the grandfathers? What did it mean to them? Giving out parts for the Seder and deciding what to leave in and what to skip. Going back to a time when it was the Zaidi, the grandfather, who pretty much ran the Seder, and how do you get people involved? What about the grandmothers? What did bubbies, what did Passover mean to them? And trying to accept the fact that it's her daughter-in-law's kitchen and she's no longer in charge. So the woman who once ran everything now has to step back and watch somebody else make recipes which she knows that's the wrong way to do it. What about Joshua? Joshua was the assistant to Moses. He was probably assigning soldiers to be on guard during the holiday in case of a surprise attack. So I'm thinking, about Yom Kippur War, 1973, and the idea that even though this is a general holiday for the Jewish people, nevertheless, you needed to have soldiers on guard because this could be a perfect time when the Jewish people are celebrating a holiday for a surprise attack. In 1973, that's exactly what happened. Right? So maybe Joshua was being told, while everybody's getting ready for the holiday, you get ready just in case the enemy tries to destroy us. What about Moses, right? It's the second year or the 40th year. What was Moses thinking as Passover came? Maybe he was celebrating the anniversary of the single greatest accomplishment of his life, when I brought the Israelites out of slavery, while trying to figure out what to do for a second act. If you're a young man and you've been the liberator of your people, but you're going to live for another 30, 40 years, then what are you going to do? How do you top that? And is your whole life living on your laurels? And then finally, God. What is God thinking about as Passover comes each year? Wondering if the Israelites understand and appreciate all that was done for them. So we go through all of those people and what Passover might have meant and its importance to them. And everybody comes at the holiday with a very different agenda. Okay, we go to chapter 29, and 29 continues 28, the sacrifices that were brought on each of the holidays. So in chapter 29, verse 7 tells us the following. On the 10th day of the seventh month of the year is Tishrei, September, October, you shall observe a sacred occasion when you shall practice self-denial. It never says that on Yom Kippur you are to fast. It says, Ve'initem, literally, you shall afflict et nafshotechem, your souls. Here they translate it as practice self-denial, and of course the denial is food and drink. But that's not what the Torah really says. It says, afflict your soul, your souls, right? And the question is, what exactly does that mean? So I'm imagining that the Israelites have this rule, Yom Kippur, you got to afflict your soul. What does that mean? I don't understand. How do you afflict your soul? So here's a discussion. It's going to be the rabbis 1,500 years later who are going to have this same discussion, and we're going to come up with their own answers and the laws in the Mishnah, and then later in the Talmud, then in the Shulchan Aruch for what do you do, what don't you do on Yom Kippur. But here's perhaps the debate of the proto-rabbis, the earliest version, the Israelites trying to make sense out of the law. Afflict your souls. What does God mean by that? I think it means we hit our bodies with sticks or whips until we bleed. That's real suffering. To show God we're sorry and we're serious. And you may be aware that there are still among certain Muslims, perhaps probably even certain Christians, many other religions, that people who as a kind of atonement hit themselves with whips or chains and draw blood, and that's their way of seeking atonement. So this first Israelite, when he reads, afflict your souls, he thinks maybe that's what God wants of us. Or here's somebody else. We walk on the hot sand and the desert stones without our sandals in bare feet. After all, you always are wearing sandals. You're going through the hot desert. Maybe this one day we're supposed to take off our sandals, and the way we afflict our souls, not just SOULS, but literally our SOLES, right? Our bare feet, by standing and hurting ourselves. So a clever pun there. And this person says there's no blood like with the whips, but it's still painful. Somebody else says, no, we spend the day remembering all the terrible things we've done. That's how you afflict your souls. It's not a physical affliction, but a psychological one. Very depressing. Somebody else says, we sit in the tabernacle for most of the day wishing we were someplace else. All that chanting and all those speeches, ugh. So once again, I'm moving Bible characters into the modern world, sitting in shul on Yom Kippur, hour after hour, not fathoming what are all these songs and what's all this Hebrew and when's the rabbi going to stop already and let's move on, let's get out of here. We go and we ask forgiveness from people we've hurt. So embarrassing. And indeed, if Yom Kippur really was that, what it should be, the idea of afflicting your souls by going to people we've offended and saying, I recognize what I did. It was wrong. I'm sorry. Let me make it up to you. That would be really hard. Or we forgive the people who've offended us. Now that's hard. I'd rather see them suffer. But okay, I get it. It's the day of forgiveness. So it's one thing when we need to be forgiven. It's another thing when somebody comes to us and says, I'm sorry. And we sort of say, not good enough. How dare you? I'm not going to forgive you. Or how about this? Nothing to eat or drink for 24 hours. I get such a headache if I don't eat. Right? Or maybe add, and no bathing. I feel so scuzzy if I don't take a shower every day. Or how about this? What about no perfume? The question is, what's going to cover up my bad breath and my body odor? And don't forget, no sex. And then the person thinks, the way I look and feel and smell, that's out of the question. Right? So God then responds, except for the whipping and the blood, I think you've understood me perfectly. So even though the Torah simply says, you shall afflict your souls, 1,500 years later, the rabbis come up with what that means are 5 prohibitions. Number 1, no eating and drinking. Number 2, no bathing. Number 3, no anointing, use of perfumes and things like that. Number 4, physical intimacy. And number 5, no leather sandals. So it seems that these Israelites, except for the guy who said, beat yourself until you bleed, everybody else seemed to be on the right track, at least according to what the rabbis ultimately came up with. Right? So God says, I think you're onto it. You've got it. Okay, we now move to the Haftorah. And something interesting happens this week. We're reading the portion of Pinchas, but we don't read the Haftorah for Pinchas. Instead, we're going to read the Haftorah for Mato, the next Torah portion. So the question is, wait a minute, what's going on? It's Pinchas, but we're reading the Haftorah for Mato. Well, why? What's that all about? So here's the situation. Tonight and tomorrow is the 17th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz. And in 3 weeks, we have Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av. And this 3-week period was considered a period of mourning. 17th of Tammuz is when the city of Jerusalem was surrounded with a siege, and ultimately they broke through the enemy, whether it was the Romans or the Babylonians, broke through the walls. And then 3 weeks later, the temple itself was burned to the ground. So during the 3-week period from the 17th of Tammuz until Tisha B'Av, we read 3 special Haftarot. They're called the Haftarot of Puranuta. Puranuta is either warning or punishment. And because of the way the calendar works out, so we have to, which takes precedent. The reading the exact Haftorah for Pinchas, or after the 17th of Tammuz, beginning the cycle of 3 special Haftorahs. And the answer is it's the latter. It's the 3 special Haftorahs. So since Thursday is 17th of Tammuz, this Saturday we have to read the first of the 3 Haftorahs of warning of punishment. Okay, so this is a very famous first chapter of the prophet Jeremiah. And it begins with God saying, "Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet concerning the nations." By the way, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there are a number of bumper stickers for the pro-life people, and they quote this verse: "Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you." It's their way of saying that God knows the fetus before it's born, and it's considered a life before it's born. So if you look carefully, you'll see these bumper stickers quoting this verse. That's clearly not what Jeremiah was talking about. He has a feeling that he was somehow chosen. His destiny in life was to become a prophet. And as you read this section, we find out that he was basically being sent with a terrible job, telling the people the message they didn't want to hear. God is angry at you, and unless you change your ways, God is going to punish you in the most horrible way. Okay? And this is a tough job. We know that Jeremiah was often beaten up. He was spit on. People threw rotten eggs at him. He was jailed at one point. It was a miserable life. But he felt, what can I do? This is my destiny. Now, here's the way I wanted to deal with this. If you're a traditionalist and you read this Haftorah, it's that God picks him, said, "I want you." And you can't run away like Jonah tried to do. You're going to do this job, and it's going to be a miserable job. It's thankless. They're going to beat you up, maybe even kill you, but this is your job. This is your mission. And even though he doesn't want to do it, he's sort of forced by God to do it. So I wanted to try, I'm thinking to myself, really? Is that the way prophecy worked? In the 2020, I can't imagine God picking somebody and saying, "You're my man. Here's your mission. This is what I want you to do." Instead, I imagine somebody with an incredible conscience who realizes there's something that I need to do because I look around and I'm unhappy with society. I'm unhappy with what people are doing. And I can't just sit back and be a bystander. I have to step in and change the world. How am I going to do it? And he's unable to mind his own business. He's got to get involved. And as we know, modern prophets, ancient prophets, it can get you killed. You're not going to be the most popular person. So here's my imagining Jeremiah and the process that he went through. Not that God picked him and told him what to say and what to do, but that Jeremiah picked himself. Okay, I'm at a crossroads. Do I go to the left or do I go to the right? I feel a calling to speak to power and to the people, to tell them that they are going down the wrong path. I feel that this is what I was born to do. Yet how can I do it? I'm no more than a teenager. I'm not qualified to take on this mission. I'm deathly afraid of what awaits me. What I plan to do is uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow our world. And then I will try to build and plant on the ruins. Can I hope to succeed at such a mission? So we wonder, students fighting the Vietnam War in the late 60s, early 70s, was it really about just teenage rebellion against their parents and society? Or were these truly people trying to do tikkun olam, repair the world, and there's nothing else that they could do at the time? Everywhere there are signs. So somebody who feels this calling, wherever he looks, things mean something to him that they don't mean to everybody else. So for instance, the almond tree. Now, Jeremiah speaks about this, and you need to know that there's a pun going on. The almond tree is called the shaked in Hebrew. And that every time I see that tree, there's a shaked, the word hits him, because the word shaked is similar to the word shoked, which means watching me. And the idea is that God is watching me. And like the almond blossoms, will quickly bring to fruition what is coming. And then he walks by, people are camping out, and he sees that there's a campfire, there's a pot on it, and the pot has tipped over and everything is spilled out. Boiling water or soup or stew has spilled out. In the meantime, he notices that the pot has tipped from the north, spilling down towards the south. Okay? A tipped over cauldron warns that trouble will pour upon us from the north. And of course, what he's referring to is that from the north, that's where the Babylonians were. And they were the threat, the warning that God was sending to the Israelites. I cannot let myself be afraid of the powerful, no matter what they do to me, for it will be worse if I do nothing. The king, his officers, the priests, the people, all stand on one side, and I stand alone against them. I must steel myself and be strong. I know their attacks will come, but I will survive. I pray that God is with me. Maybe I should try to win them over with comforting words instead of trying to scare them with threats. So it's interesting because in this Haftorah for the Shabbos, he starts and he really begins with, horrors. These are the terrible things that's going to happen to you. But it's almost like midway in this speech, he realizes, I don't have the crowd. They're not scared. They're only either ignoring me or they're hating me. I need to take another tack. And his other tack, besides scaring the daylights out of them, is to promise them that God will be there for them. No matter what happens, God will never forget the Jewish people. So that sort of explains this contradictory message that he brings. And here's the good part with which he ends. God loves the people of Israel. You are the young woman he fell in love with many years ago. And again, many of the prophets saw God as the husband and the people of Israel as the bride. And so he says, how could God hate you? He fell in love with you. You were the first love. You once followed him into the wilderness. In other words, when the Israelites left Egypt and went through the wilderness, it was as if they were the woman who follows her husband, into the wilderness out of love. Remember Huddle following Perchik to Siberia, similar kind of thing. He has not forgotten. Any nation that tries to harm you, God will destroy them. Just don't forget what you owe him. So that's sort of a modern trying to understand who this Jeremiah is and why he's doing this miserable job that can bring him only grief and unhappiness. Either because God picked him and he doesn't have a choice, or because there was something in his heart, something in his head, something in his gut that said, I can't turn away. This is my life's mission. So we'll break for a few minutes, and at 8:30 we'll pick up with Mari.